Nathan Hale was a criminology prodigy. Jeremy Sloan was a man who simply asked the wrong question at the wrong time. One vanished without a trace, and the other had spent years perfecting how to make that happen. In the small, unassuming town of Millbridge, nestled between rolling hills and quiet highways, Nathan Hale lived a life that most would describe as ordinary, maybe even dull. He wasn't the kind of person neighbors remembered when recalling their street. He paid his rent, on time, kept to himself, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Yet beneath that still surface was a mind meticulously crafting something terrifying. From a young age, Nathan was obsessed with crime. Not in the way most kids were drawn to thrilling TV shows or detective novels, but in a deeper, more methodical way. By the time he was 14, he had already read books on criminal profiling and forensic pathology. He didn't just want to understand how criminals were caught. He wanted to understand how they got away. That difference, though subtle, would one day matter. As he grew older, his fascination didn't fade. It intensified. While his peers partied or dated, Nathan dissected unsolved murders and analyzed FBI files. He began to see patterns in the chaos, flaws in investigations that others missed, and cracks in the so-called perfect systems of law enforcement. He became convinced of one thing: every killer who was caught had made a mistake, and every mistake could be prevented. By his 20s, Nathan was a standout criminology student at a respected university. He earned awards for his research and even consulted on minor projects with local law enforcement. Professors praised his attention to detail and his uncanny ability to see through red herrings. They called him a future expert in criminal behavior. But Nathan had no interest in catching killers. He was preparing to become one. In his apartment, everything had its place. Books lined the walls, true crime stories, psychology manuals, criminal codes. His laptop was encrypted and never used for social media. He avoided leaving a digital footprint even when researching. He bought burner phones, used cash-only transactions, and ran simulations of crimes late at night using crime scene modeling software. To an outsider, it would have looked like harmless academic curiosity, but to Nathan, it was a blueprint. He believed the key to the perfect murder wasn't brutality or cleverness. It was discipline, patience, precision. Most killers were impulsive or emotionally unstable. They lashed out, then panicked. Nathan was different. He didn't want revenge. He didn't hate. He wanted to succeed. Every day, he refined his strategy. He created spreadsheets comparing real-life homicides that went unsolved versus those that led to convictions. He studied forensic technology, encryption, and even cleaning chemicals. He learned how bodies decompose, how trace evidence is collected, and how false alibis crumble under scrutiny. He never told anyone about his real project. To the world, he was a promising academic. But in his mind, he wasn't studying to help catch criminals. He was training to become the one they never caught. And while Millbridge remained quiet and unsuspecting, Nathan was waiting, watching, preparing. For him, murder wasn't just a crime. It was a challenge, one he was determined to win. Jeremy Sloan wasn't the kind of person anyone expected to disappear. At 31, he led a stable, structured life. He worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized tech firm, commuted to work the same way every day, and jogged each evening along the familiar wooded trails that bordered Millbridge. He was dependable, cautious, and predictable. That routine, so carefully built for safety and comfort, would be the very thing that made him vulnerable. It was a rainy Thursday evening in September when Jeremy went for what should have been a short run. He left his apartment wearing a reflective vest, as he always did, and his smartwatch recorded his heart rate peaking during the first 15 minutes, before suddenly cutting off. The device stopped transmitting data at 8:42 p.m. Later that night, his phone was found shattered at the bottom of a storm drain 3 blocks from his usual route. It looked like an accident, but something didn't sit right with investigators, or with his family. Jeremy's sudden disappearance sparked immediate concern. He wasn't the type to leave without telling anyone. He had dinner plans with his sister that weekend and was up for a promotion at work. His friends and co-workers described him as reliable, kind, and deeply organized. Nothing in his behavior leading up to that night suggested distress or intent to disappear. Within 24 hours, a missing persons report was filed. The police began, with standard protocol, canvassing the area, checking traffic cameras, questioning neighbors. A search team, aided by dogs, scoured the trails and nearby woods. They found nothing. The rain that night had washed away any potential tracks or scents. Even the dogs, briefly excited by a scent near the creek, lost the trail within minutes. There were no signs of a struggle, no suspicious vehicles, no known enemies. It was as if Jeremy had vanished into the air. His family refused to accept that he had simply walked away from his life. They held vigils, passed out flyers, and offered rewards for information. Online communities picked up the story, and amateur sleuths began speculating about everything from abduction to staged disappearance. But one person watching those discussions knew the truth. Nathan Hale had chosen Jeremy with care. Weeks earlier, they had crossed paths briefly at a public lecture on digital forensics. Jeremy, interested in cybersecurity, had asked a question about data trails. Nathan remembered the moment clearly. Jeremy's question revealed just enough personal information to spark his interest. His job, his jogging habits, his tech habits. To Nathan, it was an opportunity. A clean one. Jeremy didn't know him. They had no connection. And that made him the perfect target. No one realized that Jeremy's disappearance was no accident. It wasn't a random act. It was a calculated step in a plan 2 years in the making. While the town searched in panic and confusion, Nathan watched from a distance, calm, detached. Jeremy Sloan was gone, and no one, not even the most seasoned detectives, had any idea just how deliberate it had all been. For Nathan Hale, the IA murder wasn't the goal. It was the execution, the precision, the flawless orchestration of every detail, each movement part of a larger plan. In his mind, this wasn't a killing, it was a demonstration. Years of study, analysis, and patience had built toward one act that he believed would prove what no theory or thesis ever could. That the perfect murder was not only possible, but achievable. He had selected Jeremy Sloan carefully, methodically narrowing down potential targets until he found one that offered the ideal balance of isolation, routine, and anonymity. Jeremy had no connection to him, which was critical. Any history, digital or personal, could become a thread investigators might tug on. Nathan made sure there were none. Not a shared friend, not a social media like. Nothing. The actual planning began 6 months before the murder. Nathan secured a private storage unit under a false name, using forged documents he had spent months assembling. The location was key, tucked into an industrial park on the edge of town, rarely visited at night, with no surveillance cameras inside the facility. Over time, he quietly modified the interior. Soundproof insulation on the walls. A large drain, built into the floor. Industrial-strength cleaning agents. He left nothing to chance. He also began mapping Jeremy's movements, following him from a distance, logging the times he left his apartment, the paths he took, how often he deviated from his routine. Jeremy never noticed. Why would he? Nathan was just another face in the background, unremarkable and invisible. Exactly how he wanted it. The night of the murder, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Nathan intercepted Jeremy mid-run, using a non-lethal electric stun device to incapacitate him quickly and quietly. There were no screams, no struggle. Jeremy never made it past the edge of the trail. Nathan had parked a van nearby, another rental under a different alias. And within minutes, Jeremy was inside, unconscious. At the storage unit, the plan continued with surgical precision. Jeremy was never meant to be found. Nathan had studied decomposition in forensic detail, learning how to accelerate or delay the process depending on environmental factors. He had even experimented on animal remains in controlled conditions. What happened inside that unit was never recorded, never spoken about, never written down. But when it was over, there was nothing left to identify. Nathan cleaned the unit with almost ritualistic care. Every surface was scrubbed. Any tools used were incinerated in a homemade furnace built in his garage. The van was dismantled and its parts sold off in separate cities over the following weeks. Jeremy's smartwatch and phone were disposed of in different locations, both left in places where natural elements would damage them beyond repair. There was no trace, no DNA, no fingerprints, no hair, no blood, nothing. To the police, it would be a disappearance without clues. To Nathan, it was a completed equation. Every variable accounted for, every flaw corrected. In his mind, he hadn't just committed murder, he had achieved mastery. For almost a year after Jeremy Sloan's disappearance, Nathan Hale walked freely through Millbridge. He passed police officers in coffee shops, overheard neighbors talk about the case in hushed tones, and watched as internet forums turned the mystery into a puzzle for armchair detectives. He read every theory, every comment thread. Most were wildly wrong, some were oddly close, but none pointed in his direction. He was invisible, just as he'd planned. He didn't feel guilt or fear. Instead, he felt validation. In his eyes, he had executed a flawless operation and escaped completely undetected. The police had no suspects, no real leads, and no motive. Jeremy's disappearance was becoming one of those cold cases that slowly faded from the public's memory. Nathan believed he had done what others only fantasized about, outwitted the system. But perfection is a fragile illusion. Nathan had taken every precaution, but he underestimated one thing: curiosity. It had always driven him, fueled his obsession with crime. And now it nudged him to return to the scene. Not out of need, but fascination. He wanted to see how the investigation was going, what the police missed, how the public reacted. So a few weeks after the murder, he made an unplanned visit to Jeremy's old jogging trail. He parked several blocks away, wore a hat pulled low over his eyes, and kept his distance. He stayed only 10 minutes. Unbeknownst to him, a traffic camera mounted on a nearby pole caught a partial image of his face as he walked back to his car. The footage sat unnoticed for months in a municipal server until, during a routine digital sweep of the area around Jeremy's last known location, a newly updated facial recognition program flagged it. The match wasn't strong, but it was enough for a detective to take a second look. Still, it might have ended there. Just another false match, if not for Nathan's other mistake. While participating in one of the many online forums discussing the case, he used a VPN to mask his IP address. It had worked perfectly for dozens of posts. But during one late-night session, The VPN briefly disconnected. For a few seconds, his real IP address was exposed, and the site's server captured it. That digital footprint led straight back to his apartment. It didn't take long for authorities to connect the dots. Nathan's academic background in criminology, his suspicious forum activity, and his proximity to the location caught on camera painted a concerning picture. With enough circumstantial evidence, they obtained a search warrant. What they found inside Nathan's apartment shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Dozens of notebooks lined his bookshelf, filled with handwritten entries detailing methods of body disposal, forensic weaknesses, and step-by-step breakdowns of real murder cases. One section, in chilling detail, outlined a plan that matched Jeremy Sloan's disappearance almost exactly. There were no names, but the timing, location, and sequence of events were unmistakable. Nathan had covered his physical tracks perfectly, but it was his mind, the very thing he believed made him untouchable, that betrayed him. Nathan Hale's trial began in the spring of 2024, under heavy media scrutiny. By then, the story had already captured national attention. News outlets branded him the scholar killer and the mind behind the murder, fascinated by the irony of a criminologist using his knowledge not to solve crimes, but to commit one. Courtrooms were packed, online discussions exploded, and true crime podcasts dissected every detail of the case. But beneath all the attention, one unsettling truth remained. Jeremy Sloan's body had never been found. Despite that, the evidence against Nathan was overwhelming. Prosecutors relied heavily on the notebooks seized from his apartment. Each page provided a disturbing glimpse into his process, detailed entries about abduction strategies, forensic evasion, and post-crime behavior. One particular notebook, marked only with the date of Jeremy's disappearance, laid out a scenario eerily similar to what investigators had pieced together. Though there was no direct confession, the narrative was so exact that it left little room for doubt. The forensic analysis of Nathan's digital activity added more weight. Experts traced multiple accounts back to his apartment, despite his attempts to use VPNs and secure browsers. His posts on crime forums, under various aliases, contained information that had never been released publicly. He referenced details only the perpetrator could know. How the police had searched a mile too far north, how the phone was damaged before it hit the drain, how the dogs lost the trail because of nearby chemical runoff. He gave away just enough to sound smart, but not enough to make it obvious, until investigators connected the dots. In court, Nathan sat still and quiet. He didn't testify. He barely reacted, even as prosecutors described his plan as methodical, emotionless, and chillingly precise. Psychologists who assessed him testified that he showed traits of narcissism and psychopathy, calculated, detached, and deeply obsessed with control. To them, this wasn't a murder driven by passion or desperation. It was an intellectual exercise, a puzzle. The defense had little room to work. They argued that the notebooks were academic in nature, that his forum posts were part of an online role-playing exercise. Without a body, they claimed, there could be no conclusive proof of murder. But the jury wasn't convinced. Too many pieces fit together too perfectly. The planning, the disappearance, the surveillance footage, the exposed IP address. The detailed, date-matched entries in Nathan's own handwriting. After 2 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. Nathan Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even behind bars, he never showed remorse. He never explained himself. He refused interviews, ignored letters, and withdrew completely. Jeremy Sloan's body was never recovered, and his family was left without closure, only the grim certainty of what had happened. What haunted investigators most was not just the murder, but how close Nathan came to succeeding. He had studied the system so well that, for almost a year, he stayed ahead of it. In the end, it wasn't a slip of the hand that caught him, it was a slip of the mind. The very intellect he relied on became the thread that unraveled everything.